the other speakers. That was brilliant. Such a level of detail as well. And I'm going to touch on some of those same things in my talking. I'm going to read 3 extracts from my novel Penknife, and also some bits of the research materials that I drew on when I wrote it. And hopefully a combination of the fictional and the factual will give you a good flavour of the time and the place. I wanted to write a coming-of-age novel which was partly based on my experiences of getting into trouble as a teenager growing up in Brightlingsea, which is in a small seaside town in the northeast of Essex. And I thought a good starting point for a coming-of-age story would be the moment of leaving school, because this is a crossroads in anyone's life, especially if you haven't got a clue what you're going to do next. And even more so if you've been expelled without qualifications, like my young protagonist in the novel, Jared. And when I thought back to the summer when I'd left school, in 1984, I remember the striking miners in Brightlingsea, picketing the wharf and Wivenhoe port. And after doing some research, I realised this could be fresh material for fiction, because the story of the miners' strike in Essex didn't appear to be widely known. And I also wanted to pay tribute to the people like my mum and Mick Barry, who's over there, who accommodated striking miners in their homes. I think that's something to be proud of and remember. The first reading is from chapter 1 of my novel, from Penknife, and it is May '84, and Jared is being driven home across Essex by his single mum after being expelled from a state boarding school just a few weeks before he was about to take his exams. We'd come off the A12 and joined the long tail back of traffic on the approach to Colchester. I unclipped my seatbelt so I could loosen the strap, then stretched out my legs and began to relax. Well, sort of. Mum switched on Radio 4 and they were reporting on the miners' strike. Talks had broken down because officials from the coal board had refused to discuss pit closures. Some of the kids at school had assumed they were striking over money, but I tried to put them right. Thatcher planned to close a load of pits because she said they were uneconomic. What she really wanted, Mum had told me, was to destroy the miners' union in revenge for the strikes the Tories had lost in the 70s. If I tried to start a conversation about the strike, I'd be able to gauge whether Mum was willing to talk about anything else yet, apart from me being expelled. She surprised me by mentioning it first. They've been bringing in coal through Wivenhoe and Brightlingsea, did I tell you? No. Bringing it in from where? She turned down the radio and explained that scab coal was being sneaked into small ports from Eastern Europe to boost stocks and underline the strike. Some miners from Kent found out what was happening and had come to picket locally. Mum told me she was on the committee of the miner support group in Brightlingsea. We're organising places for them to stay. That's brilliant, Mum. It sounded like socialism in action, backing each other up, solidarity. My favourite band, the Style Council, were already playing benefit gigs for the miners. I'd read about it in the NME. Sharply dressed socialist and poetic and political lyricist, Paul Weller was everything I wanted to be, but I didn't have a group, or any money, or even a decent haircut. For the first and perhaps last time that day, Mum smiled at me. I'm glad you approved, Jared, because Tony's been sleeping in your room, and I don't think it's fair to ask him to move just because you've been kicked out of school. Who the hell's Tony when he's at home? A striking miner from Kent is going to be staying with us during the picketing at Wivenhoe. You could have given me a bit more warning, Mum. Then I remembered I wasn't even supposed to be back for another 6 weeks. We were already in the shadow of the overhanging trees next to the old church on the way into Brightlingsea. As we came round the tight bend and back into blazing sunshine, the only sound I could hear was the car engine, and the scene was so still and familiar, it felt like we were bursting through the middle of a painting. Cheers. My own memories of having miners to stay are quite vague, but I do remember that they always got really spruced up with aftershave and the best clothes before going to the pub, which was the Yachtsman's in Brightlingsea, where they would play pool and darts, and the landlord would often lay on sandwiches. Or so I heard, because, like Jared, I was too young to drink in the pub. I also remember being asked if I could get them any porno videos. I'm not sure if that was a joke, because in my memory they were always having banter, especially when they got together. When researching the novel, I was lucky that I was in touch with people who'd organised accommodation for miners in the town. One of them, Mick, who I mentioned, had kept an archive of material like letters and leaflets and newspaper articles which he allowed me to have access to. And he's actually got some more stuff over there. An example of the research materials is this letter from May 1984, which was distributed to people in the town who were accommodating miners or paying a levy, which I think was £1 a week, to support them. And it's entitled Information Bulletin 1. I'm just going to read the first paragraph to give you a flavour. Firstly, congratulations all round. So far, people in the town have provided accommodation at various times for over 150 miners from Kent, Scotland, Derbyshire and Durham. They have genuinely been overwhelmed by local hospitality. The level is now into its third week, with over 35 regular payers already. A year or so earlier, in Brightlingsea, there was a campaign against a wharf being built in the town. And I remember the posters up in what seemed like most of the front windows in the town saying, "No wharf," and they were everywhere. The campaign ultimately failed, and it was interesting to discover during my research that the miners then referenced the wharf when appealing for support from local residents in Brightlingsea. And I've got this letter here, and this went out to every house in Brightlingsea from the National Union of Mine Workers Kent area. And I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs to give you a flavour. Many of you, this is May 1984. Many of you, especially those living near the private wharfs, are witness to what is taking place in your communities. The local wharfs have been given permission to operate around the clock, and as a result, scores of heavy lorries are continually running through the narrow streets, causing damage to your properties. Local interests are being overlooked in order that the importers of blackleg coal can make a fat profit, irrespective of the consequences. Your campaign against the wharfs has not been successful. Join with the miners, and together we can force those who disregard our interests to see sense. Miners' jobs are being sacrificed so that the government can force down the living standards of all people, except the few profiteers. And the wharf was actually where the scab coal was being brought into Brightlingsea, and therefore that was the focus of picketing in the town. I've got this is the front page of the Evening Gazette at the time. This is Wednesday, April the 11th, 1984, and you can see the headline there is "Riot," in inverted commas, at the wharf. And then when you read the article, the justification for using that word riot comes from an eyewitness, a local antiques dealer, who said it was like a riot. Things got really ugly. But when you go on to read the article, there's no evidence at all of any actual rioting, or even any arrests in this instance. So I find that ironic that I tried to draw on factual material to make my fictional representation as accurate as possible, and then you have a newspaper that is supposed to report the facts, inventing a riot. In the novel, as well as reading the local papers and watching the news, Jared gets to hear first-hand accounts of the local picketing from Tony, the miner who's staying with him, and his mum. He also becomes friends with a young feminist called Verity, who tells him that her dad is a communist and they have 2 miners staying at her place. Jared is curious to see the picket lines for himself, and also to be able to impress Verity with a story about it. So he goes to Wivenhoe, which is the main focal point for mass picketing in the area, on a day which he overhears Tony telling his mum will be the biggest day yet. Now, it's quite a long scene at Wivenhoe, so I'm just going to read a part of it. And we join it when Jared is on a tightly packed passenger bridge. I don't know if many of you know Wivenhoe, but which leads across the rail track to the port. We came to a halt when the pickets at the front were held up by coppers at the bottom of the stairs. From this position, I could see over the port wall. There were cranes moving around between what looked like huge sheds and at least 3 massive black piles on the ground. 2 trains clattered past on the line below while we were still stuck on the bridge. There was an outbreak of sarcastic cheering when we finally got moving. Then the chant I'd heard on the news. Here we go, here we go, here we go. On the other side of the bridge, we were released in small batches and made to walk in single file through a corridor of coppers onto the grass verge at the left of the port gates. I kept my head down, so I wasn't able to clock if they were wearing numbers or not, but I was convinced that this lot were the heavy mob. They were wearing boots with more holes than any punk or skinhead I'd ever seen. Were we being lured into a trap? Well, it was definitely a sun trap because the back of my neck was roasting. It seemed to have got very hot very quickly. I smoked one of my last 3 Bensons as the grass verge filled up slowly around me, and I carried on looking out for Tony. I remembered what he'd said the previous night about stepping up the pressure over picketing rights. By hook or by crook, by coach, car or foot, they were coming to North Essex from all over. Kent had got here first because they found out about the scab coal coming in from Poland. Then, a few weeks ago, Derbyshire had started arriving in Brightlingsea. Now there were Welsh miners holed up in Wivenhoe, and I could hear Scottish accents behind me. But I still hadn't spoken to anybody. I looked around to see if I could catch someone's eye, but everybody else was busy chatting or reading the papers. The miner, the mirror, and the socialist worker. Everybody was waiting for something to happen. It all changed when we heard the first lorry rattling down the road towards the port. I imagine this is what it was like to be a film extra. After hanging around for hours, you suddenly had to be ready to spring into action and do another take. Except this was going to be my first take, and nobody had shown me the script. I followed everybody else and pushed into the geezer in front with all my strength. When I pressed my palms against the back of his t-shirt, it was already soaking wet. The scent of our collective sweat was pungent, but not unpleasant. It smelled earthier than the sickly sour milk odour the kids gave off at school. I wanted to believe the difference was because they were miners, but I guess it was really just because they were men. A new chant started, which we grunted in a low, hypnotic hum. Heave, heave, heave. It must have had some effect because we moved forward by a couple of metres, but that wasn't enough to test the police lines. I was relieved when the heaving stopped, even though it meant that we'd lost the first round. I'd already run out of steam, and now I had time to find my bomber jacket, which had slipped down from my waist and was being stomped into the ground. Over the revving of anxious engines, I heard one word being spat out again and again. Scab, 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 scab. They made it sound like a scab was the most despicable thing that anybody could ever be. I stood on tiptoes and clocked one in the flesh. He was a scrawny old geezer with greaseback hair and a roll-up stuck to the side of his mouth, gesturing frantically to be allowed to drive forwards. The scab was flanked by a line of coppers with their arms linked together. The police had us where they wanted us, hemmed in tightly against the port wall, and not a single picket was allowed to reason with the drivers. And it's worth noting, I think, and it was mentioned earlier as well, that some of those drivers collecting scab coal were members of the Transport and General Workers Union. And this is confirmed actually in this article from the front page of the Essex County Standard from Friday, May the 4th, 1984, and this time they are reporting on genuine arrests, more than 100 arrests on Port Picket Line, and that would have been pretty much the peak of the mass picketing in Wivenhoe at the time. And in the article, a spokesman for the Colchester branch of the Transport and General Workers Union tells the paper that they had issued a directive to their members not to cross picket lines, but, and this is a quote, "it's difficult to see what action could be taken against them." Wivenhoe Port closed in 1992 and is now a housing development. When I first attempted to write the big picket line scenes, I was struggling to recreate the location in my mind. And then eventually I came across a short film, Inside Out and the Miners' Strike, which was made for the BBC by musician and Wivenhoe resident Martin Newell, which included local news footage. And by being able to study this and see how things looked back then, this helped to give me the confidence to pull it off. And if you want to watch it, it's available for free on Vimeo. Another breakthrough I had was discovering this book. I don't know if any of you have seen it or remember it. Strike Breaking in Essex. And this was written by Moira Abdul Rahim, and it was written at the time, and it's all about the policing of the miners' strike in Essex. And it contains some great nuggets of information, including one I'm going to share with you because it's too good not to. So, the book reveals that the manager of Wivenhoe Port was a man called Dave Watts. It turned out that the port was financed in 1981, so 3 years before the strike, by Dave's brother, Danny. Danny was an ex-police officer who'd made a fortune from property development. He was also the main sponsor of Wivenhoe Football Club, who were doing well at the time. During the picketing, Danny was able to allow his old friends in the force to use the football pitch as their, quote, tactical command headquarters. A very cosy setup, I'm sure you'll agree, and I would like to have included that detail in my novel, but I think perhaps it would have been seen as a bit too convenient and neat and maybe even unbelievable. Just got one other little gem from Wivenhoe before moving on. It's just a one-paragraph story, I think it's from the Gazette. Winning Number is the headline, and it says, "One police officer at Wivenhoe Port this morning received a specially warm welcome from picketing miners. The miners cheered loudly as the officer drew up in an unmarked police car with a rather topical number plate, NUM. And then it goes on to say, if you can't beat them, join them." So, again, if I'd put that in the novel, I'm not sure it would have sounded plausible. Following on from his picket line experience, and over a long eventful summer, Jared gets drawn into petty criminality, while at the same time trying to show his best side to Verity. This includes going out together to deliver a letter to all residents from the miners' support group, inviting them to a public meeting at the community centre, where a speaker from the NUM will be present. And I've got the letter here, and I hope I haven't lost it in this pile of stuff. Yeah, no, I've got it. And it is, you can see it there, this is the actual newsletter that I based that on. And it's titled, "Which Side Are You On?" And this is an appeal to the community to help the miners. And this is from July 1984. And this again went out to all residents. And I'm reading from the beginning. "The miners' strike is now in its 5th month. Brightlingsea Miners Support Group has been coordinating accommodation for picketing miners and collecting money for miners' wives and families for the last 3 months. So far, over 300 miners have been accommodated in the town with supporters, and over £500 has been raised through a regular weekly levy and collections and sent to miners' wives groups in Kent and Derbyshire." And again, it goes on to bring up the wharf and appeal for support in that way, saying that that the wharf has led to a massive reduction in the quality of life for many local residents. And then towards the end, it mentions a food convoy travelling to Kent from Essex, which they're hoping to fill a van from Brightlingsea with non-perishable foodstuffs and other domestic miners items. The newsletter ends with the "Victory to the miners," as we all know, was a common cry. Okay, so just moving, the theme of getting into trouble and showing support for the miners' cause comes together in the last reading I'm going to do from the book. This is from chapter 6 of Penknife. And Jared is round at his best mate Colin's house, and they're eating cheese on toast, and then they are joined by Dennis, who is armed with a bottle of stolen whiskey. And here we go. "I've seen that before, it's crap," Colin said, after studying a few seconds of a black and white sci-fi film on BBC One. Colin's favourite programme was Star Trek, but he'd watch almost anything that showed life on other planets. He swore that he once saw a UFO down the prom, and no amount of piss-taking would ever get him to admit that he could be wrong. He switched to BBC Two, and I heard a tantalising mention of Orgreave. "Leave that on, can you, just for a minute, please?" He sniggered at my pleading tone. "If it's boring, I'm turning it over." I had to think quickly how to get them interested, because the Tory on the telly was rambling. I was like Owen in The Ragged Trouser Philanthropists, trying to fit in a lecture about socialism before Crass called the painters back to work. Colin and Dennis were always going on about hating the old bill, so I explained how they'd stitched up the miners by allowing them to picket at Orgreave coking plant, and then ran around in riot gear, beating them up. 6,000 coppers, I said, all looking for blood. "I thought you wanted to watch the programme," Colin said. "I do, yeah, but there's no point in listening to that lying bastard. Did you know that the first thing Thatcher did when she got in was to give the old bill a 45% pay rise? And now look, they're paying her back with interest. Well, they're still getting loads of overtime for it." I took a sip of my whiskey and reached for my Benson's. And now she's chucking the weight of the state against the miners. The army, secret services, the lot. Dennis took a gulp of his whiskey without flinching, or even wincing. "All right, Bogus, no need to get all excited." "Here we go," I said, excitedly, when the programme cut from the studio to the fields. A barricade of crash-helmeted cops with long plastic shields stretched across the width of the screen. Behind them, pigs on horses rode at a canter between two rows of trees. Colin snapped a custard cream with his teeth. "They think they're in a western, don't they?" The long shields parted and the cavalry burst through, sending pickets scattering across the dry field in panic. Then came the ones with short shields, followed by regular nipple-head plods swinging truncheons. A picket stumbled in no man's land and was grabbed, gripped and coshed. As the nipple-head clubbed him like a seal, two of his cop mates just stood back and watched. Even Dennis was leant forward on the edge of his chair. "Bloody hell, he must have nearly killed the geezer." "He'll get away with it as well," I said. "That's why they don't wear their numbers, so they can get away with murder." My hands were trembling with fury, and I spilt half my whiskey onto the yellow foam of the ripped settee. Luckily, Colin was too engrossed to notice. He got up to turn off the telly when the report cut back to the Newsnight presenter. "They've really wound me up now. Makes you feel hard, does it, you wankers?" I could see his reflection in the blank screen as he squared up to it. Above the telly was a framed 1,000-piece jigsaw his old man had completed, a brightly coloured fish swimming in the ocean. "The old bill have always been scum," Dennis said. "That's their job. If the frigging miners don't like it, why don't they just get back to work, like every other mug has to?" Dennis didn't have a clue. "The whole point of the strike is that pretty soon half of them wouldn't even have jobs to go back to." "Bollocks, they're having too much of a jolly, ain't they? I saw a few of them down the swimming pool the other day, laughing and joking like they were on holiday." "They're just making the most of it. It ain't a holiday, going picketing for £3 a day and risking getting stitched up or battered by the coppers. It's rough, mate, I'm telling you. I got a little taste of it at Wivenhoe." "Yeah, once. If you feel so strongly about it, how come you ain't been back?" "I've done other stuff." I didn't think I had to justify myself, but Dennis had managed to touch a nerve. There had to be something else I could do. I'm going to buy some spray paint tomorrow, I announced a few minutes later, and put a message on that new pig station. Denny scoffed. Yeah, I snapped. Colin sniggered weirdly like the whiskey had taken effect. There's no need for that. Why not? They deserve it. My old man's got some spray paint in the garage. Yeah, but I don't want to get you into trouble. Trust my big mouth to get me into trouble. Still, at least it was going to be for something political. And if I shit out now, I'd be asking for ridicule. No, I would show them that I had the bottle to back up my convictions. But I needed to strike while my temper was hot. So that's the final reading from the book. And just to round up, Orgreave and the way that the strike was policed has a big effect on Jarrah's attitude towards them in the story. And in fact, like many of the striking miners, he finds himself being stitched up by the police. 10 years after the strike, Brightlingsea was in the national news because of large protests against the export of livestock through the town. It still saddens me that the support and attention given to this cause dwarfed that shown to the miners during their stay. But for all those people in Essex who showed solidarity by welcoming miners into their homes, going on picket lines, demonstrations, giving their time, their money and their food, the book exists partly to keep your acts of solidarity alive. Thanks, Penknife. And we've got some copies here if anybody wants one.